I'm grateful to these people who spoke. I'm grateful especially to Father Bruntrup for that laudatio, which was lovely and well thought out. And this is what I want to say in response to the laudatio. On 9/11, the day that the planes hit the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, I was at the Jesuit school, Xavier University, to help inaugurate the new president. In the first moments of that attack, no one knew what other attacks might unfold that morning. No one knew what would happen, and the shocked country thought that maybe the end of the world was beginning. And all I could think was that if the world was going to end, I was very lucky to be with the Jesuits. If we were going to be engulfed by tragedy, then I thought there would be no better way to live through it than to be surrounded by the faith and the great-heartedness of the Jesuits. And so it definitely means something to me to accept this honor from this Jesuit school and this community of Jesuits. Your friendship is precious to me. Your fidelity to your vocation is consoling to me. And your many achievements and accomplishments are a gift and a blessing to all of us. So to be honored by the Jesuits, and especially by this Jesuit university, is to be honored indeed. And so I accept this award with great gratitude. As the news of the recent weeks and months has made us all aware, we live in times of sorrow and suffering for many people. And so in these brief remarks today, I'm going to talk about what it is to flourish as a human person, even in the midst of suffering. The disability rights movement has made us all conscious about our contemporary attitude towards suffering. Although we sometimes praise a person who suffers for not sinking under his suffering, we still tend to suppose that the sufferer is to be ranked more among life's losers than among life's winners. Even if we think of a person who stands under his suffering as heroic, we tend to think of whatever is good in his life as happening in spite of his suffering. And in general, we are inclined to find perverse anything that values suffering itself. On the contrary, anything that undermines physical or mental thriving strikes us as lamentable. But it is worth noticing that the current disability rights movement wants to call this attitude into question. The disability rights movement wants to celebrate what others have generally pitied or disrespected as the suffering of misfortune. It wants others to see that those with disabilities are not among life's losers or even among life's heroic overcomers of the tragic. Instead, the disability rights movement holds disability pride parades. Here is an excerpt from a text by Sarah Triano, the founder of the Chicago Disability Pride Parade. She says, "The sad sack, the brave overcomer, and the incapable are worn-out stereotypes the parade refuses by giving us a time and a space to celebrate ourselves as we are. First, we want to show the world the incredible joy that exists in our lives. We are part of the richness and diversity of this country and of the world. The parade is an international celebration of our continued and continuing survival. By marching in this parade, we are giving the world a chance to express pride in us too." From the patristic period onward, the Christian tradition has held a roughly analogous position, not as regards disability, but as regards suffering in general. It has supposed that those who endure serious suffering are not the pitiable losers of life, or even the heroic overcomers of tragedy. Rather, they are those who are specially loved by God. That is because on this view, suffering is not only medicinal for the human condition, but is also a gift of God's to those who are nearer to God. John Chrysostom says of people who are scandalized at the sight of human suffering, those scandalized people don't know that to have these sufferings is the privilege of those especially dear to God. Now, clearly, there is something right about the contemporary, unreflective rejection of suffering as bad. Someone who valued suffering as an intrinsic good would be mentally disturbed at best and evil at worst. But there is nonetheless something worth exploring in the Christian attitude towards suffering as a gift. In this lecture, I'm going to look closely at the relevant Christian doctrines to see what can be said to explain this attitude towards suffering and to distinguish it from the neighboring perverse attitude that sees suffering as an intrinsic good. There's a biblical text in 2 Corinthians that expresses the relevant Christian attitude in a paradigmatic way, and it will be helpful to approach the examination of suffering through the claims in that text. In 2 Corinthians, Paul makes this claim: "As the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so also our consolations abound through Christ." According to this claim, for a suffering person in grace in this life, her suffering is somehow correlated with the consolation she has in or with Christ. The comfort and help a sufferer has from Christ can intensify as her suffering increases. Later in the same epistle, Paul says, "Beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, we are all changed into the same image, from glory into glory through the Spirit of the Lord." And Paul goes on to connect the glory of that union with suffering in this way. He says, "Our light afflictions, which last only for the moment, bring about for us a far greater eternal weight of glory." In other words, according to Paul in this epistle, the suffering endured by a person in grace is one source of that person's glory or spiritual loveliness, as we might like to say. On Paul's thought in the epistle, something about suffering which seems to deprive a person of flourishing actually enables or enhances the flourishing of the sufferer. To begin to understand Paul's thought about suffering, consolation, and glory, it's necessary to work slowly through its elements, beginning with the nature of human flourishing. Although discussions of human flourishing are by now something of a cottage industry, for my purposes here, a person's flourishing can be thought of as his thriving. So understood, the opposite of flourishing is not being sick. The opposite is rather something like being dysfunctional. The failure to thrive is a broad category that encompasses any kind of impairment or impediment to the proper functioning of some part of a person or even of the whole person himself. Thought of in this way, it's evident that thriving comes in different modes. To begin with, we can distinguish the thriving a person has when he suffers no impediments as regards his body from the thriving he has when he suffers no impediments as regards his mind. We can think of thriving, that is, either as bodily thriving or as thriving of the mind, and it is possible to have one of these modes of thriving without the other. So, for example, there are people who are in excellent bodily condition, but who suffer from mental illness or some other impediment of mind. Buzz Aldrin was in peak athletic condition when he flew to the moon in 1969, but he later acknowledged that he suffered from serious depression. On the other hand, clearly it is possible to have great bodily impediments, but to be thriving in mind. Harriet McBride Johnson, that's a picture of her on the screen. Harriet McBride Johnson's an example. She was a highly accomplished, highly intelligent disability rights activist, but she had serious bodily impairments. In her New York Times Magazine article chronicling her extended arguments with Peter Singer, a Princeton philosopher who advocates preventing the birth of people with disabilities, Harriet McBride Johnson describes herself this way. She says, "I'm extremely thin, My flesh is mostly vanished. I'm a jumble of bones in a floppy bag of skin. My right side is 2 deep canyons. To keep myself upright, I lean forward, rest my ribcage on my lap, plant my elbows beside my knees. I am the first generation to survive to such decrepitude. So by her own description, Johnson suffered from very significant impediments as regards bodily thriving. On the other hand, however, her meaningful work and her excellence at it, her very ability to handle exchanges with such opponents of the disability rights movement as Peter Singer, to handle those disagreements with intelligence and courtesy and wit, all these testify to her great thriving in mind. There is a general consensus that, other things being equal, thriving in mind outranks bodily thriving. That is, few people would be willing to trade diminished bodily thriving for comparable diminishments of thriving in mind, and this common attitude seems right. On the scale of value commonly found in the Christian tradition and much contemporary thought as well, the best thing for human beings is a matter of relationship. And if they are serious enough, impediments with regard to thriving in mind are more of a barrier to relationship than roughly comparable impediments to bodily thriving, other things being equal. Furthermore, on the traditional Christian scale of value, the greatest human flourishing, the greatest human relationship is with God. And that is why the greatest thriving for a human person is in that relationship. And even with serious impediments to thriving in mind, it is possible for a human being to have a deep relationship with the deity. So consider, for example, this report of religious experience on the part of someone suffering from significant mental illness and confined to a mental hospital for years. This patient says, "At one time I reached utter despair and wept and prayed to God for mercy instinctively and without faith in any reply. That night, I stood with other patients in the grounds waiting to be let back into our ward, and suddenly someone stood beside me and a voice said, 'Mad or sane, you are one of my sheep.' I never spoke to anyone about this, but ever since, 20 years, it has been the pivot of my life." Even among those people who have both bodily thriving and thriving in mind, few people have such powerful religious experiences. The religious experience this patient reports was so great as to center his life for a long time, as he tells the story, and to bring him consolation throughout that whole period. The closeness to God of the original experience and the ongoing relationship with God it provided was great enough to endure through many years of that patient's life in the hospital. And so even for human beings with serious cognitive impairments, meaningful and fulfilling relationships of love are possible. I'm going to skip this slide. It contains a long quotation from the philosopher Eva Kate about her daughter, who has such serious impediments to thriving in mind that she doesn't have language even, but her mother reports about her loving relationships and her thriving as a human being, and we will just take it as read. So you can see then that although other things being equal, serious impediments to thriving in mind are more likely to undermine a person's flourishing than comparable impediments to bodily thriving are. Flourishing in loving personal relationship is nonetheless possible even with significant impediments to thriving in mind. Furthermore, as the example of the patient's religious experience illustrates, when God is one of the relata in the relationship, then even those things that might obstruct relationship between two human beings, such as major mental illness, are no bar to relationship. What these considerations should help us recognize is that bodily thriving and thriving in mind do not exhaust the modes of thriving for human beings. A human person can have impediments to thriving of both body and mind because of the ill treatment of other people, because of lasting bodily and psychological damage, and yet that person can have thriving as a human being. And there is thus a third mode of thriving. Harriet Tubman seems to me a good example of this third mode of thriving. She was born a slave, and from early childhood she was recurrently separated from her family. When she was 6 or 7 years old, she was farmed out to a different household as a house slave, as a nanny to their baby. In that job, child though she was, she endured severe beatings, and she was often deprived of sufficient food and adequate clothing. Later in life, as a result of the abuse of one slave master, she suffered a serious head wound, which left her with lasting neurological problems. Throughout the rest of her life, she seems to have suffered from narcolepsy and other manifestations of brain damage as a result of that injury. It is difficult to believe that in addition to the neurological problems she suffered, she didn't also have lasting psychological problems from the trauma of the abuse she endured as a child. And truly, this is only the beginning. The story of the sufferings of her life are too great to be summarized adequately in short space here, and it's hard to tell, hard to read, even in abbreviated form, because the cruelty inflicted on her is heartbreaking. When she was a young woman, Harriet Tubman succeeded in escaping from slavery, and she spent all the rest of her long life rescuing other slaves and working for the abolition of slavery, often in very dangerous circumstances. When a biography of her was being prepared during her lifetime, she asked Frederick Douglass to write a recommendation for the cover of the book. And this is what he wrote to her, Frederick Douglass, so worthy of honor himself. He said to her, "You ask for what you do not need when you call upon me for a word of commendation. I need such words from you far more than you can need them from me, especially when your superior labors and devotion to the cause of the lately enslaved of our land are known as I know them. I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have." The great honor in which Harriet Tubman was and is so rightly held by so many people, me included for sure, that great honor bears witness to her thriving as a human being. She is not a bent or a broken or a failing specimen of the human species. On the contrary, she is a shining example of humanity. And we do not honor her out of compassion as someone who heroically overcame the tragic circumstances of her life. Rather, anyone with integrity has to acknowledge that she sets a standard for human greatness, and so also for thriving as a human being. But she had that thriving with serious impediments to thriving of body and thriving of mind. What the case of Harriet Tubman shows us is that thriving of body and thriving of mind are neither necessary nor sufficient for personal thriving. There's a third mode of thriving too, and it's hard to know what to call it, but because it seems to be the thriving of the whole human being rather than the thriving of a part of a human being, I'm calling it personal thriving. Because it is the thriving of the whole person, personal thriving outranks thriving of either a body or thriving of mind, or both of them combined. Human flourishing, then, is not just a matter of thriving in body or in mind or both. It's a matter of thriving as a whole person. And this thriving can occur even when a person suffers from significant impediments as regards both mind and body. As the example of Harriet Tubman illustrates, the depredations of other human beings, the consequences of severe poverty, the misfortunes of nature, and other similar afflictions cannot take away from a sufferer the possibility of flourishing. For even resplendent human flourishing, it is not necessary that the impediments to thriving of mind or body be prevented or removed. I want you to hear what I say now. I recognize the troublesome appearance of this claim and the dreadful misuses to which it can be put. But if this claim were not true, then human flourishing would be another monopoly of the wealthy Western countries, or at least the upper classes in those wealthy Western countries. Wealth can go a long way towards the prevention and the amelioration of impediments to thriving of mind and body through the nutrition, medical care, and education that wealth makes possible. But wealth is neither necessary nor sufficient for human flourishing, and consequently, neither is the thriving of body or thriving of mind that wealth produces. But I want to add loudly and quickly that this claim should be no consolation for those people who cause suffering to others, or whose indifference contributes to other people's suffering, or who fail to remedy other people's suffering when they can readily do so. That flourishing is compatible with suffering does not imply that such people are not hateful in their conduct. It's hard not to notice that just as the patristic thinkers supposed, some diminishments in thriving of body or thriving of mind can in fact be woven into personal thriving. That is, the bodily or mental diminishments in thriving can in fact contribute to personal thriving, not because they constitute challenges that a person surmounts, but because those very diminishments are themselves ingredient in that person's thriving. The diminishments are integral to personal thriving in the sense that their removal would constitute the removal, or at least the lessening, of the personal thriving. Harriet Tubman's suffering from the depredations of the slave society around her and her consequent impairment in both mind and body seemed to be part of the fabric of her character, marked by her charismatic leadership in her society and her self-sacrificial care for others. Or think of this same point the other way around. How many people who live an upper-class life without much serious suffering, without much of any impairment in mind or body, how many of those people count as having great personal thriving? How many people in a life of ease, with little tribulation in it, seem to be an example of human flourishing that other people would love to be like? On the contrary, greatness of personal thriving seems to be found largely, if not exclusively, among those who suffer greatly too. It is difficult to think of anyone who lacks such suffering and yet excites powerful admiration for the personal thriving of his life. That suffering can lead to great personal thriving seems to me overwhelmingly confirmed by evidence of all kinds. Historical reflection, psychological studies, as in those studies being examined by the group in the Templeton Project here, and plausible fictional narratives also. But why it should be so is harder to see. On the scale of value for flourishing, which is maintained in Orthodox Christian theology and widely held even by those who don't accept the theology, human flourishing has relationships of love at its heart. But the post-fall human condition is characterized by a tendency to turn away from such relations into willed loneliness and isolation. And so the post-fall human condition inclines a person in a direction that undermines flourishing, when flourishing is understood as a matter of relationships of love. Suffering can make a difference to this condition in varying ways. To take just one example, because suffering is generally aversive, it can drive a person to seek a remedy. And that remedy will have to be sought, at least in part, in the help other people can provide. Or if all remedies fail, then suffering can incline a person to seek just the consolation that other people can give by their presence and compassion. Even when suffering cannot be taken away or diminished, it can somehow be made more bearable by the consolation of the presence of loving others. For one reason or another, then suffering can break in on a person's inwardness and loneliness and isolation. The aversiveness of suffering can fuel a person's willingness to seek connection with other people. A suffering person may turn to other human beings, but it is also widely recognized that in suffering a person is likely to turn to God too, even if this turning comes with anger or protest, as it does in Job's case. It is common to find religious belief and religious experience among those in deep distress. It is less common to find true religiosity, true religious experience among those who live at ease. For Tubman, God was always present to her and engaged with her. One of her biographers describes an experience that was typical for her. It occurred at the time in her life when she was first contemplating returning to slave territory to rescue other slaves. This is what the biographer wrote about Tubman. The biographer said, Tubman had great fears about her future course, and she confided to me, "The Lord told me to do this." I said, "Oh, Lord, I can't. Don't ask me. Take somebody else." But Tubman also reported that God spoke directly to her. "It's you I want, Harriet Tubman." As this and other anecdotes from Tubman's life illustrate, suffering is part of an ongoing process in a person's life in which flourishing can develop and increase. The correlation between suffering and flourishing depends on second personal relationships of love, and such relationships are dynamic, not static, even where God is concerned. It is part of traditional Christian theology that God will give grace to anyone who doesn't refuse it. But clearly a process of this sort will expand rapidly if it's continued. That's because the grace given enables a person to remedy her own great fragmentation and so to be more willing to be open to love and goodness. And that increased openness will be met with more grace, and that will grow her in goodness, and that will result in more grace, and so on. Insofar as suffering opens a person to love and deepens her in closeness to God and others, it is an element in that growth. Certainly, what makes Tubman exemplary for us increased in her throughout her life. I have no wish to support anything that would seem in any way to make light of Harriet Tubman's suffering. The suffering inflicted on her by the people promoting and maintaining slavery highlights the terribleness of the human post-fall disorder for which no words seem negative enough. Nonetheless, with diffidence, I want to suggest that Tubman's life also illustrates the complicated thought in 2 Corinthians that I set out earlier, and the traditional Christian attitude towards suffering represented by the quotation from Chrysostom that I gave at the outset of this lecture. On the complex thought in the Pauline epistle, in virtue of suffering, a human person can grow in flourishing, even with irremediable and significant impediments to thriving of body and of mind, until there is in her life such flourishing that it is right to think of it as glory. Harriet Tubman's flourishing came to her in virtue of her suffering, and the result is that her life is an example of the best a human life can be. The connection that the epistle makes between suffering and glory is illustrated in her life. And her life also illustrates the epistle's claim that consolation increases with affliction. That Harriet Tubman is as exceptional in her ongoing religious experience as in her great-heartedness and her suffering, that's evident not only from her own testimony, but also from the testimony of others who knew her. Her contemporary biographer summed up the matter this way. The biographer said, "Harriet spoke of consulting with God and trusted that God would keep her safe. Thomas Garrett once said of Harriet Tubman, 'I never met with any person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God as spoken direct to her soul.'" This evaluation of Harriet Tubman's religious life is surely right. At any rate, it is highly doubtful whether any of those in the relatively well-to-do slaveholding communities around her lived in the kind of ongoing powerful religious experience she had. And so the epistle's correlation of glory and of consolation with suffering seems well illustrated in her life. On this way of thinking of suffering, it's not hard to see why Chrysostom would think that those who suffer more are those who are more dear to God. And here it is important to me to highlight what I am not claiming. I am not claiming that the good of human flourishing justifies any human being in causing or permitting or failing to remedy suffering of the sort Tubman endured. To say that a person flourishes as she does, at least in part in virtue of her suffering, that doesn't imply that it would be acceptable for another human being to permit it, or to cause it, or to refuse to remedy it if he could readily do so. It is one thing to claim that some suffering can lead to the flourishing of the sufferer, and another thing entirely to claim that a person is justified in causing or allowing such suffering on the part of another for the sake of that flourishing. In addition, the consolation that increases with affliction, as the epistle describes it, that consolation may not occur at the same time as the affliction. It may come only later. Even those who seem to lack all consolation because they are burdened by depression or something else that leaves them destitute of ordinary human peace, those people may yet find that their suffering enables them to flourish later with greater peace and greater joy than others who have not experienced such desolation. Finally, someone may suppose that for every one person such as Harriet Tubman, there are countless others who do not flourish in their suffering. But such a claim about the relative proportion of people who suffer without ever flourishing in consequence seems to me unsupported by any good evidence. Suffering is not always transparent even to the sufferer, let alone to those around the sufferer. You might think you're completely healthy, for example, when in fact you're suffering from metastasized pancreatic cancer. You just don't know it yet. And flourishing is similarly not transparent either. The lab might have sent you somebody else's test results by accident, and so you might think you have tuberculosis, when in fact you are completely healthy. In this respect, consider Sophie Scholl. There she is on the screen. She attempted to protest in Munich the Nazi evils of her time, but she was caught by the Nazis. They put her through a speedy show trial and very quickly executed her. She was buried in an outcast grave at what was then the edge of Munich. Hardly anyone around the world then knew who she was or cared to know who she was. But now, she is honored the whole world over for her courage and her willingness to risk her life for the sake of justice in her community. She is honored for the flourishing of her short life, and now her grave is never without fresh flowers. So it is possible for a person both to suffer and to flourish in ways invisible to others, at least for a time, at least in this life. But the flourishing is real nonetheless. Consequently, the claim that most sufferers find no flourishing in their suffering is not only unsupported by any empirical evidence, but in fact it's such that empirical support for it is in principle very hard to come by. And so here's the end of my story. With these caveats underlined, then it seems to me right to acknowledge that there is a connection between the flourishing of the life of a sufferer such as Harriet Tubman and the suffering she endured. It seems to me true to say, with the thought of the epistle, that she flourished in virtue of her suffering. If there is something heartbreakingly shaming about the human species, in consequence of its part in such horrors as the slavery of the South in the U.S., then the gloriousness of Harriet Tubman's life is highlighted by contrast. With all the impediments as regards mind and body which were a suffering for her, who would not grant that the flourishing of her life greatly outranked that of the slaveholders, whose lives had vastly less suffering than hers, vastly outranks even the lives of those Northerners who lived at ease and were content not to occupy themselves with the troubles of others? Who would pick one of those Southern slaveholders or one of those indifferent Northerners as exemplary of human flourishing? Who would do that? By contrast with the life of Harriet Tubman, their lives look sad or shaming for our species. And if, like the slaveholding Southerners or the uninterested Northerners, Harriet Tubman had just lived a life of relative wealth and comfort, then it seems unlikely she would have become the woman we are now honored to honor. And so there is something deeply right in the traditional Christian attitude about suffering. A person is more than the sum of her mind and her body, and there can be a magnificent flourishing of the whole person, not in spite of, but because of the suffering she endures. And with that, I am done. Thank you.